So my name is Jeremy, and I'm thrilled to be here today. Really excited for a number of reasons. First, let me thank you guys, the people in this room, by building the gear and other things that I know are going on at Samsung. I've probably brought VR to more people in the world than anybody, so give yourselves a hand there. Thank you. I've had the absolute pleasure of spending time with a couple of people in this room from Samsung, and it's really special to be here today. My background is in psychology. My PhD is in cognitive science. In 1999, I decided to switch fields and leave psychology and to learn how to build the hardware and to program the software to build immersive virtual reality. At the same time, to ask bigger, more social questions about how VR changes training and communication and entertainment as opposed to how the brain works. And so for 20 years, what I've been doing, or for 19 years, what I've been doing is building VR, putting people inside and running experiments to see what it does to the mind, and building applications that leverage what's unique about the medium in terms of helping people enjoy themselves and become better. So I thought about this, and with bringing VR to so many people comes responsibility. And in this room, where there's friends in this room, what I'm going to say to you guys is I want you guys to think. And the first bullet point there is called time machine. And what I mean by that is, if you think about Samsung's business now, think about phones, think about televisions, there's probably something you would do differently if you could go back in time. Something you would do differently about the design of the phone, about the design of sensors, about the design of televisions, that if you made the choice and you changed that, and I'm not picking on Samsung here, any technology, hardware or software company, we make mistakes, we do things design-wise that has implications we hadn't foreseen. So one of the things I'm doing today in this room is deviating from my kind of stock talk about VR and leveraging the opportunity I have to talk to you guys in this room and to say, look, I'm going to give you guys some suggestions of things that I think you should do, that we should do, and you guys decide if you want to do it. The first is tracking data. I'm about to publish a piece for the Journal of the American Medical Association on what one can do with the tracking data you get from virtual reality devices. And when we think about phones, we know where you are, we may know what you say. Virtual reality captures your body language. It captures where you're looking, where you're standing. It's an intimate degree of tracking data. And I want you guys to think ahead about what is it when everyone's using Samsung VR devices, what is it you want to store? What is it you want to record? What is it you want to protect? I don't have time to go into too much detail today, but using machine learning algorithms, I can predict a lot from where you're looking inside of a virtual scene. The next bullet point is on leadership. On this point, if you think about our Silicon Valley colleague, Mark Zuckerberg, is currently testifying in front of Congress about the role that Facebook has in terms of people's data. Wouldn't it be great if Samsung could take some leadership role here and say, on the hardware devices in virtual reality, this is how we're thinking about your personal data. And when I mean your personal data, I mean the most intimate psychological view into who you are, which is how you're moving your body. Okay, I don't know how this is going to play in this room, and I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands. I talked on the phone on the drive over here. I was hands-free, it was legal, but I missed an exit. I was so into the conversation that I missed an exit, okay? I literally drove worse because I was talking on the phone, even though I was doing it legally and hands-free. There is a certain number of deaths per day in the United States due to distracted driving for all reasons. I'm not going to say how much of that is the phone, we don't know. The question I have for you guys in this room, if you could change your hardware such that you wouldn't have a phone work in a moving car, would you? And I don't want you to raise your hands, and I don't want you to yell at me I'm not accusing anyone of being bad in this room. I talk on the phone in the car. But a certain number of people per day, it's estimated at 9, die in car accidents due to distracted driving. As designers, if you go back in time and say, you know what, phones don't work when it's going more than 6 kilometers an hour, would you do that? And I don't want to talk about phones because that's not my expertise. With immersive virtual reality, you may say, no one would ever drive using VR, right? That'd be insane. It turns out we have data on this. There's a video game called Pokemon Go, which is an augmented reality game where you're looking through a tablet or a phone and getting real-time augmentation. And we know of many car accidents that occurred while people driving the cars playing Pokemon Go. So I promise you, people will be driving while wearing Samsung virtual reality products if we let them. And so my begging question to you guys is, can we make it so, forget software because software can always be tweaked, the phone VR system from Samsung does not work in a moving car. Can we do that? And you may be arguing, well, the passengers need to use it, and then what about the driverless cars? And 9 people a day die. So that's my plea to you guys, and sorry to get intense there. Guns. I'm happy to share a piece I wrote for CNN about the modeling with behavior that goes in terms of the muscle memory you get for shooting. And I don't want to go into too much detail on this today, but my ask for you guys in this room is if it comes to the point where we're building video games that are really realistic in terms of the way that you play the game as a gun-like device, Samsung, we make hardware, I'm asking us not to make really realistic guns as inputs to our first-person shooter games. And finally, I just want to reiterate the thanks. That was an intense 5 minutes, and I just wanted to make you guys think. We're friends in this room, okay? And I just want you guys to think about these issues. Okay. So everyone's done VR. Raise your hand if you've not done VR. Anybody not done VR? Okay, let's get these guys on the second floor over there. I'll tell a story about psychological presence. So Matthew Lombard, communication professor in the early 90s, defines presence as the illusion of non-mediation. When VR works well, there's no pixels, there's no gadgets, there's no field of view, you're just having an experience. And so in the year 2001, I flew my really intense, heavy hardware to Washington, D.C., and we gave a big demonstration for the Federal Judicial Center about how you'd use virtual reality in the courtroom. Things like recreating crime scenes or eyewitness testimony where witnesses look at lineups of suspects. And the demo that we have that's our most impactful demo is called Walking the Plank. And you can see a demonstration of it there. The person puts on the goggles. We hit a button where we drop a chasm. Chasm's about 10 meters deep. There's a little plank to get over it. It takes about 3 meters to get across. And we were running people through this demo because it's one of the best demos we have in terms of really showing the power of VR. And we had a federal judge. He was in his probably mid-60s. He probably weighed north of 250 pounds. And when he was walking that plank, he just took a little baby step to the right. Okay, so we modeled gravity, and so visually and sound-wise, the world for him, he started rushing to the bottom of that pit. Okay, now if you were walking across that plank in the physical world and you fell off to the side, how would you save your life? You would dive at a 45-degree angle and try to catch the lip of that pit while he was going down. So we had this federal judge who literally visually stepped off the plank and decided to dive at a 45-degree angle in the middle of thin air. Okay, so he literally dove. It gets even worse. This is my first public demo. I've now given tens of thousands of these in the last 20 years, and we had the computer sitting on a table with a very sharp corner. Okay, and so what this guy does is he dives, and his face is going right towards this sharp corner. So we had one move, which was to kind of knock into him and to redirect his trajectory, and so he fell to the ground, and he didn't hurt himself. And so he was fine. Okay, we didn't get sued, and we didn't go to jail. It was in a room full of lawyers. Everything was fine. But this illustrates presence, which is that when VR is working well, the front of your brain can say it's not real. The back of your brain, the part that's in charge of keeping you alive, can't get through the illusion. And since then, we've shown with dozens and dozens of experiments that the brain and the mind tends to treat VR experiences when they're done well as if they were real. And making this point, the reason why I dedicate 3 or 4 very precious minutes in this talk to this is that everything I'm going to say to you for the rest of today is that you can use these VR experiences to change the way people think and the way they behave. I mean, the title of the book is called Experience on Demand. And the smart way to think about VR is not as a media experience, but as an actual experience, because the brain tends to treat it as such. So my lab at Stanford, we've been at Stanford since 2003. We have visits from heads of state. We have visits from CEOs of big companies. We have visits from the military. It's a place where people come to experience virtual reality. We have a floor that shakes. We've got 24 speakers that can spatialize sound. We've got virtual scent that we use. It's a very neat place, but it's quickly becoming obsolete from a technological side. I mean, if you look at my lab's webpage, and we've got all these academic papers, 80% of them were using these goggles over here, each one of which costs more than the car that I drove here today. What we have now, because of companies like Samsung, we have the gear, which costs the price of an expensive dinner or a bottle of wine when you take into account the phone itself and all of these other instances. So it's a very special time where, a few years ago, there was only 1,000 of these floating around, maybe 1,500, depending on how you count them. Now there's conservatively, as of yesterday, I checked them to prepare for today, conservatively there's about 15 million of these devices floating around the United States when you take into account a lot of the phone-based systems. So this is my grandfather, Popper, and Popper, when I put him in, he was 91, and he kind of looked around a little bit, and he said, "This is kind of cool, but what's the point? What am I supposed to be doing in here?" And as a guy that talks to thousands of people about virtual reality, the median reaction from people that have tried VR before is, it was okay. I liked it, but it's not something I would do. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands in this room, but how many of you guys use VR every day, once a week? The answer is probably not many of you, and the reason is because really, what's the point of doing it? The theme of today's talk is paradox. VR leverages two things. One, the brain tends to treat it as real. Remember that judge that dove into nothing. On the other hand, you can break all the rules. You can turn physics off. You can go back and forward in time. You can change your body such that you've got 3 arms instead of 2. There is no rules in VR. So it's this very magic medium where the brain treats it as real, but you can do anything. And what I'm going to talk about today are the things that we've studied in my lab for 20 years, leveraging this paradox, doing things that you can't do otherwise. The brain tends to treat it as real, and how you can apply that. Now, this is a part of the talk that I actually don't give that often until recently. So my book, which just came out, has been reviewed by the New York Times, by the Washington Post, by the Wall Street Journal, by Nature, by a number of, in general, people love the book. When I get criticized, it's because I've quote unquote drank the Silicon Valley Kool-Aid and I'm too much of an optimist. And what the media wants me to do is focus more on the downsides. And I'm still an optimist, and I still believe that by far we're going to do the right thing, and I'm not worried. That being said, I want to talk about possible downsides to the medium of VR before we move on to the good stuff. The first is distraction. We talked about this in the driving context. We've already had our first death in virtual reality, unfortunately, in December in Moscow. There was a man playing an immersive virtual reality video game. He fell through a plate glass table and he bled to death, according to a newswire out of Moscow. So that's the first one I've heard of, and the fact that there's only been one is fantastic, I suppose. But distraction is something that's very real. Addiction. All of us struggle with how much we're using digital media and our devices. VR is going to be no different. So here's a quote from I'll read you the quote first. "Several times during the experiment, the participant was confused about being in the virtual environment or in the real world and mixed certain artifacts and events between both worlds." So this is a quote from a German psychologist from the University of Hamburg, a very reputable psychologist who spent 24 hours straight inside of virtual reality and had one of his research assistants monitor him. He demonstrated by hour 17 an inability to differentiate things that were happening within VR versus outside. The recent person who broke the Guinness Book of World Records for most time spent in VR as of a few weeks ago, I believe was 36 hours. When he came out, he said, "I can't feel my body below my neck." There's really some issues with spending too much time inside of there. Simulator sickness is the idea you get dizzy because of bad experiences, experiences designed to move the camera around. We talked a bit about violence and media game modeling. So my lab has been supported by the US military throughout my career as a VR scientist. We know VR works for training soldiers. If we build games such that the skills you are learning actually teach you how to shoot with giving you muscle memory for it, it's something to consider. Kids. We just published a new report. There's a free report online from Common Sense Media. It's called VR 101. It's for parents to understand what's okay and what's not okay for their kids in virtual reality. And I'll show you a clip from Jackie Bailey's research here.
Do a couple things for us, okay? Ready?
Oh, hello there! It's Design, your lovable furry friend Grover. Hi. Get up out of your chair and dance with us. Follow our crazy moves. You can do it.
Jackie's research, she's now a professor at the University of Texas. She's examined hundreds of kids in immersive virtual reality, most of them 3, 4, 5, and 6 years old. This research sponsored by Sesame Street, Sesame Workshop. And the kids, they meet Grover, they meet Elmo, and she basically studies the influence characters have on your behavior, on your executive function in terms of inhibiting experiences, and she compares a VR experience to a TV experience. And what her data is showing fairly robustly is that compared to watching TV, you're more likely to comply to a request by Grover. So when he asks you to dance, you're more likely to dance. After you leave VR, when Grover asks you for stickers, you leave VR and the parent says, hey, you know what? Can you give Grover some of your own stickers? You're more likely to share with him. Her research is showing that kids are very susceptible to influence inside of VR. Now the good news is she's run hundreds of these kids, and they're, for 5 minutes at the pop with their parents present. No one's gotten sick, no one's gotten dizzy, no one's had nightmares. So that's the good news. On the other side, VR is a very powerful medium. So we just spent time going through the downsides of VR: addiction, distraction, simulator sickness, blurring reality. So my argument for you guys today is that given VR is maybe a medium we should be a little careful with in terms of spending time, let's reserve VR experiences for things that if you did them in the real world would be impossible to do, would be counterproductive to do, meaning you'd learn some lesson, but it'd probably be bad for you or for others. Things that are so rare or expensive that you can't do them in the real world, or for things that are dangerous to do in the real world. And I'm going to go over each of these individually for the rest of this talk. Let's start with impossible. And I'm going to talk about a line of research that begins in the year 2003, and this video is now 15 years old. And it's going to merge two psychological theories, or a sociological theory and a psychological theory. The sociological one is called the contact hypothesis. And this says basically when groups don't get along, for example, blacks and whites in the 60s, if they go to the same school, if they have that social contact, they're going to learn to get along. The second one is called body transfer. And this is a neuroscience theory that shows that if you move your physical body and you have an avatar, a digital representation of you, either seen in the first person or in a mirror, if that avatar moves what's called synchronously at the same time as you, over about 4 minutes of you moving around physically, seeing your mirror image move with you, the part of the brain that contains the schema for the self expands to include this external representation. So that's a long-winded way to say your avatar in VR, if you move around a bunch and it moves with you, after about 4 or 5 minutes, you really feel psychologically it's yourself. Okay, so what we wanted to do is ask the question, can you use VR to change the way people think about discrimination and prejudice? And so let me show you this movie. And I like to show this even though the graphics are quite old. So white male moving around the room. He eventually walks up to a mirror, sees himself as a white male in the mirror. You're going to see 10 seconds of this, but he does it for about 4 minutes. He's moving in the physical world, and his avatar moves with him, and he's a white male. He's moving around. We force him to move your arm this way, that way. He bends down. We hit a button. He comes up, and he's now a woman of color. Okay? Very intense reaction, and in fact, the reaction we get from this is often as intense as what happens when we open up the plank and the hole in the floor. The next phase in this experiment is after you've become someone else, we redo the body transfer instructions. You're wearing someone else's body. And then we network a second person into virtual reality with you. And then that person tends to treat you poorly. say some pretty intense things about your race, about your age, about your gender. And what we study is when you're wearing someone else's body, feeling discrimination firsthand, how does that compare to other techniques of changing the way you behave? Let me give you an example of the type of study we'd run. So in this experiment, half the subjects became visually impaired, meaning that with the goggles we removed the ability to see well, and they had to do a very difficult sorting task where they're trying to mix and match different screws into different buckets. Really hard to do when we take away your ability to see well. The control condition is the gold standard of diversity training currently, which is role-playing, imagining that you were impaired while doing this task and pretending, okay? What we then do is we never trust in these types of studies, we never trust self-report data. We never ask you, are you going to help others? Are you going to be less prejudiced? Because all of us in this room, we want to be better in this instance, but it's really hard to change your actual behavior or actual bias. And so we measure what they do. And in this study, what we had then is after they left the study, we paid them and said, hey, you know what, if you want to volunteer to help people who are impaired, here's how you can do it. And we gave them a way where they could basically surf the web, email webmasters who had pages that would be hard to see if you were visually impaired, and ask them to change things like the font and the color. And what we demonstrated is that when you become impaired, you spend twice as much time helping others compared to when you imagine it. And that's the type of study that we've been doing for the past 15 years, where we've looked at issues of race, of gender, of age discrimination, and in general, not every single time. And if you read chapter 3 of the book, I'm really careful about not trying to overclaim our findings. It doesn't work all the time. People always ask me, Jeremy, is VR the ultimate empathy machine? And I say, well, look, you would never claim that the medium of video magically causes empathy. It depends on what you do with it. And so my answer with VR empathy is it depends on what you do with it, but when you design these experiences in the right way, what our research has shown is that it tends to change behavior more effectively when it comes to issues of prejudice compared to role-playing or reading case studies or watching videos. You can also show empathy to yourself, staying in this idea of doing things that are impossible. This is a study run by a PhD student, Hal Hirschfield, who's now a professor at UCLA in the business school. He wanted to ask the question, can you make people care more about the future? Okay, so humans, a philosopher called Parfit has long argued that we're really good at imagining pleasure now, what we're going to have for dinner tonight. It's very hard imagining pain in the future. Hence, people are very hesitant to defer gratification. We like pleasure now. How do you get people to defer gratification? And so what Hal did is we scanned their faces using a 3D scanner, then they'd walk up to a virtual mirror and they'd do body transfer. We'd hit a button, and then we'd take a 20-year-old and we'd use computer graphics to show her or him what they'd look like when they were 70. In other words, you'd become older in front of your eyes in the mirror. And then we'd have some kind of conversation where you'd be socially reinforced that you'd become someone older. The critical question here, so Hal, his advisor is Laura Karstensen. She runs the Center for Longevity at Stanford, where the center's trying to, given people are going to live longer, how do you make people enjoy life? One of the ways to make them enjoy life is to make it so they're not in poverty. Okay, so 20-somethings today are not putting money in the bank, and they're going to live till they're 90 or 100, so they're not going to have enough savings. So what Hal's studies did is that you'd become older in the mirror, and then we'd give you a choice. Here's $20 now, or if you put in a savings account, you can have 40. You just can't touch it for a little while. And in general, off about a dozen studies, what Hal's research showed is that when you become older in this mirror, you're more likely to defer gratification. The fun part about my job now, in part because of what the people in this room have done with the Samsung Gear, is I get to scale my work out. And so we're working with a number of financial institutions. This is the first to go to market is Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and they figured out from your laptop's webcam how to do a 3D scan of your face. And now when you open a Bank of America account, you'll have the option to enroll into face retirement. And what face retirement is every time you're doing online banking, your future self is staring at you, okay? So every decision that you make, and then the more money you put into savings, the happier your future self gets, okay? And this falls in the land of win-wins, right? Bank of America is getting more money because people are investing, but the 20-somethings are now actually putting their money in the bank and are going to actually not be in poverty when they're 60. So there's about 4 or 5 other companies that are doing this as well. I like to highlight Bank of America because they were first. We've also built an interview simulator. So everyone in this room has been interviewed, and most of us have done interviews. And it turns out that all of us are biased. We know that from so much research, and I'm sure that Samsung, we do HR, where we all learn about our biases. What we've built is one example for you to practice to overcome your biases. So think of this as a flight simulator, a place where practice is free and mistakes are encouraged for doing interviews. And so you can do an interview and we can change the skin color, the age, the gender of the person, and we track where you're looking, we track your posture, we track what questions you ask in what order, we track the tone of your voice. So you get to do an interview and then you get to relive it passively, watching yourself look around and say things. You get to become the other person and receive the gaze and feel what it's like to be the interviewee, and then you get to do it again. And it's the idea of making mistakes. So what kind of bugs me personally about a lot of diversity training is that you basically do this exercise and you realize, whoa, I'm biased. And then it stops there. All right. What this is an opportunity for you to practice being better, a way for you to basically, we're all biased and nothing's going to magically make that go away, but we can learn how to not express that bias and slowly to get better. And there's a number of companies that are using this for the way to train their employees. All right, I want to shift to the idea of using VR for things that if you did them in the real world, that it would be counterproductive, okay? And the best model I have here is about climate change. Okay, so one of my academic heroes is a woman named Dr. Jane Lubchenco. She was the head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration under President Obama for 4 years. In that 4-year window, there was more natural disaster in the United States than in any other 4-year window in U.S. history. Climate change scientists, of course, agree that this is the intensity and the frequency of these events are due to climate change. However, many citizens and many lawmakers do not agree. So this is a quote from Dr. Lubchenco, and I interview her in my book in chapter 4 of her going to visit the district of a lawmaker, and I'm not going to name him, who was an extremely vocal climate change denier. His district got hurt really badly by a natural disaster, lots of damage, lots of people getting hurt and killed. And when she, put her boots on the ground to help the people there, he looked at her and said, "I have seen the light. I've become a believer." He was talking about climate change. He had a direct experience seeing his district get ravaged by natural disaster, and all of a sudden he believed in climate change, similar to the state of Florida. All lawmakers in Florida talk about climate change as a serious threat because it's hitting them right now. But in virtual reality, disaster is free. I hit a button and you see your town gets decimated and you don't have to feel it or no one gets hurt. And so I love to give a 2-hour-long talk just on this, and I'm not going to waste too much time. Let me talk about this study. This is our first study in the environmental domain. It had people cut down trees. So it turns out that soft, fluffy toilet paper that we all love, an article came out in 2009 in the New York Times. It said if you use that really soft, fluffy toilet paper, it turns out it comes from non-recycled pulp. 50% of that pulp comes from second-growth forest. 10% comes from virgin trees, most of it along the coast of Canada. So it turns out we are deforesting for a cause that's probably not that critical using toilet paper. That article comes out in 2009. Nothing has changed. If you go to any supermarket in the Bay Area, you may not find recycled toilet paper, but if you do find it, it's going to be hidden and it's not going to be the main brands displayed. So how do you change behavior? And so this is Sunju An's work. She's now a professor at the University of Georgia. She had 3 groups of subjects. One group, everybody got the stats I just gave you. Then one group read a beautifully written narrative of what it'd be like to cut down a tree. The second saw a video shot from the shoulder of a lumberjack as he was cutting down a tree. And the third put on the goggles, had a haptic device that rumbled their hands, were forced to cut down 2 trees, and then when the trees fell, it smashed the ground up, really felt like they were cutting down this tree. Okay. Really intense experience. So this is a demo I still give in my lab, even though the graphics are over a decade old. And people that come through my lab, I'll get a phone call and they say, "Jeremy, I was going through the toilet paper aisle last week and I thought about you." And I said, "I think that's just fine. Okay, that's what we're going for." But we never trust self-report. So it turns out in our experiments, we asked people before and after, "Do you plan on using less paper and recycling more?" Everybody said yes, regardless of which condition they were in. Sunju found a way to track paper use, real paper use afterwards. And those who were in the VR condition reduced their paper use by 20%. People in the control conditions didn't change at all. So think of VR, it gives you an experience, and this experience is what causes a behavior change. Think about who you are in this world. experiences you've had along the way make you who you are. VR gives you an experience. Now, here's the counterproductive part. If I were to teach you all about toilet paper by driving you to Big Basin or to Muir Woods and forcing you to cut down 2 redwoods, that'd be a really bad way to teach about deforestation, right? And VR gives you the best of both worlds. The brain treats it as real, but nobody gets hurt. I want to talk about scalability, so I won't go into the details, but I've built, with funding from the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation, it's an 8-minute field trip. So one of my roles at Stanford, I work with the provost to rethink Stanford's online learning strategy, and where I'm settling in with VR is field trips, things that anyone can do anytime, to augment your classroom experience. And we built one about climate change in the ocean, about something called ocean acidification, which I won't go into detail now to save time, but it's a 7-minute marine science module where you learn about the effects of coral and sea life based on humans producing carbon dioxide. So what have we done with this thing? So after we built it, we spent a couple years building it. We've put it in classrooms, in high schools, in colleges. And what we can demonstrate with really good data on a paper that's about to be published in the next week or so is that people can learn quite well from these VR experiences. It integrates well in high school classrooms, and it works. But more than the efficacy of the learning is also the motivation. And so you're seeing as a screenshot, Dawn and I were talking about the history of the Tribeca Film Festival and their VR wing. You're seeing in 2016 the VR arcade where we premiered the Stanford Ocean Acidification experience. And the way Jane Rosenthal, the genius that runs that festival, it's an arcade model where people come in for 3-hour chunks and they get to do all sorts of VR experiences. We had a line of 100 adults for about 11 hours a day for 8 days straight to learn about chemistry, okay? And there's this motivation to use VR because it's fun. And it's, the idea that VR, you can gamify learning and they will come and do it has been one that's been perhaps overused over time. But I'm telling you, with our VR demos, we haven't seen any reduction in this kind of magic that people want to do it. And I do think the motivation to learn is a good one. We've done a lot of work with policy. So I was lucky enough to be invited to give a briefing to the US Senate where we brought our ocean acidification demo and we briefed senators, congresswomen, congressmen, and talked to them as a tool to use VR to teach them about policy as it relates to climate change. And it's a very special experience. Dawn had mentioned that we're premiering a piece called Coral Compass, Fighting Climate Change in Palau. And what we did there with Palau, and we used the Samsung gear when we were there, we actually went on a 10-day dive trip and captured all the damages to the reefs of Palau based on human activity. We put together a 3 or 4 minute experiential learning reel, and then in VR we actually showed the lawmakers of Palau what was happening to their precious reefs because their economy is based on tourists coming, given what the regulations on tourism, how it was getting, how the reefs were getting, because they were already weakened by climate change, how the tourist activity was actually causing great harm to the reef in some spots, and actually got to witness some changes in policy based on showing them that data, and it's just a really neat tool. But most excitingly for me right now, as a guy that's been doing VR for 20 years, the fact that I can build something, test it to ensure that it works, and then package it up as an EXE file, and then send it to everyone else that's got a Samsung gear, it's really special. So this is one of the screenshots for Steam, which is a Stanford Ocean Acidification experience, has been downloaded many times, and we're just giving this stuff away. It's a really neat way to think about learning. Okay, my next bucket is going to be about using VR for things that are so expensive and so rare that you wouldn't want to do them. And I would gather to say that most VR experiences that you've done fall into this category. Checking the time. Okay, good. I'm going to leave us 7 minutes for questions and answers. Is that okay? Yeah. So Derek Belch was a field goal kicker for the Stanford football team, and in 2005 he took my virtual people class. He said, Jeremy, can you use VR to train athletes? I said, Derek, it's a brilliant idea, but technology's not here yet. Come back in a decade. And he did. In 2013, he was a master student in my lab while being an assistant coach on the Stanford football team, and he convinced Coach David Shaw, a very genius, forward-looking individual, to donate 5 minutes of practice time on Mondays. Now, coaches, they choreograph practice to the 30-second chunks. He gave us 5 minutes where he dragged out before there was a Samsung camera, there was a really intense, bulky rig to capture 360 video, and we'd capture about 10 plays where our defense would pretend to be the other team that we're going to play this Saturday. We then go back and stitch everything together, put it in the football office by Wednesday, and what the players would do then is train, and they weren't training running and kicking and throwing, they were doing decision making. Look around a scene, recognize a pattern, make a decision, and then communicate that decision to others. In football, what that means is that the quarterback goes to the line of scrimmage and he has to decide to keep the original play, which is called let it roll, go to the next play down the queue, which is kill, 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 or for either of those options, he can have a running back move and pick up a blocker. And after 3 weeks of training, Coach Shaw decided he should make it mandatory for all of the quarterbacks to use to train. That season, our quarterback Kevin Hogan and the coach David Shaw both will say that this practice, this mental rehearsal, caused Stanford to outperform their expectations that year. Now, Derek Belch graduates 2015, January 2nd. Like many Stanford students, on the 3rd he starts a startup. It's called Striver. And Striver, then Derek just shocks the world. In the next 3 months, he sells 5 or 6 NFL teams to multi-year contracts to do it. As of today, this is a fraction of the teams and organizations that are using it, but suffice it to say that hundreds of thousands of people have now trained using things like the gear to look around, recognize a pattern, make a decision, and communicate it. And what I want to highlight is Walmart. From our test, we've seen the associates that go through VR training retain what they've learned in those situations better than those who haven't. The over 140,000 people who graduate from academies each year will have VR as an integral part of that experience. So the way Walmart worked is that we were demoing a Walmart executive. One of the football teams we worked with was the Arkansas Razorbacks, and there was a Walmart guy there, and he said, what you're doing with the quarterbacks is the exact same thing just about every employee at Walmart has to do, which is look around, see a pattern, make a decision, tell others about it. And so we went to one of Walmart's training academies. They have 200 of them, and we installed VR there, and what we built were things like Holiday Rush, people coming at you from all over the place, yelling at you, screaming, giving you extra repetitions, or detecting a safety violation. Look around the room, is there a sharp knife out? So we went to one training academy and we collected qualitative data, and they loved it, they loved training in it, and we had kind of self-report qualitative data that it worked. We then went to 30 of them, and we took the 30 academies that had them and paired it with 30 that didn't, and did a quantitative comparison and showed that the people that used VR outperformed the ones that did not. And now we're in all 200. And this is, I don't say this lightly, I've been doing VR for 20 years. This is the first time that hundreds of thousands of people are using VR on a daily basis for kind of a normal activity. They're not soldiers, they're not athletes, these are just people using VR to do their job. I'm happy to talk about Chipotle, Nationwide, BMW, Fidelity. There's a lot of people who are using this. I've gotten to watch this kind of scaled use of VR in a way that I didn't expect to see this quickly. I'm going to close on using VR for things that are dangerous. Okay? And when I say dangerous, what I'm going to talk about today is one of my professional quests, and I hope to do this with Samsung, I really do, is to get rid of driving. 40,000 people died last year driving cars. In the worst year of my life for public events during 9/11, at least 5 and closer to 10 times as many people died in cars that year as they did from terrorism. Cars are just bad. They're bad. No offense to my friends who work for the audio industry, and I, of course, drive a car, but boy, wouldn't it be great if we can get rid of the commute? And maybe not every day, because we all want this. Like, you guys now feel like you know me a little better, and I'm glad to meet you, but maybe we commute 3 days a week instead of 5. And maybe we commute only when we have that very special meeting, but getting in this metal box, driving behind all these other people in metal boxes, then getting to a desk and pounding on a computer, and then getting back in this box, it just doesn't make sense. If you think about the productivity lost, you think about the deaths in car accidents, the road rage, the germs on trains, there's a better way to do this job. And so one of my professional quests, and again, I give a 2-hour-long talk just on this slide here, is how do you produce what I call the interactional synchrony, to quote Adam Kendon from 1970, this magic social interaction that occurs where my eye gaze is meeting you guys and you see my posture and the latency works well, where we're not there with video conference, it's still worth coming to see me talk as opposed to watching me on video, but with VR, can we get there? And a lot of my professional life is dedicated towards getting there, and there's people in this room that are amazing in that domain. So I'm going to sum up quickly because I want to hear questions. Thank you.